comes rum coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer. Send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there, over there, over there. Send the word over.
Hey everybody, this is Joshua Littrell. Thank you so very much for joining us today on the Veterans for Cannabis podcast. Today's going to be a different day. I know we've done a couple of different things here in the month of May, and today's it's going to be a tough podcast for me to get through, as we're about a month out from Charlotte FIGGY passing away, and I apologize if I take some time in between on this, and I'm not able to hold this together, but I want to go through Charlotte and just talk about her for a moment. And this podcast is going to be a tribute to Charlotte FIGGY, who was such a huge advocate in this cannabis space, and big, mover in the hemp and CBD industry. Charlotte FIGGY was a wonderful young lady who passed away at age 13, and she was not expected to make it past the age of 8. I've had the great honor of meeting her mother, Paige. Her mother, Paige FIGGY, actually came out to Georgia. Shoot, I don't know if it's been way back in 2014, 2015 maybe. So 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I guess. She spoke in front of the Georgia legislative body. It was the first time I'd actually seen Paige in person. I knew a little bit about Charlotte. I had seen some of the stuff that Dr. Gupta had done, and Dr. Gupta was at the time posted out of CNN out of Atlanta. So he was kind of local to the area, but Charlotte and Paige were living in Colorado, and Paige just went through and told her story of what was going on with Charlotte. Charlotte was a young girl who was diagnosed with Dravet syndrome, and I think many of you all have heard of Dravet syndrome over the last few years. It's a rare form of epilepsy, which is not often it's not able to be controlled by medication. And the biggest issue that you run into there is you've got these parents who are at wit's end trying to figure out what can they do for their child, who some of them are oftentimes born normal. They don't really have any issues at all, and then boom, it hits them, at a year old, 2 years old, whatever. A lot of the children are born with Dravet syndrome. I think everybody's born with it, but it manifests differently in each child. Charlotte's syndrome wasn't controlled by medication, which was a huge issue for her mother and father at the point in time, and they were trying to figure out what they could do. The Stanley brothers, I think many of you all know them, and Charlotte FIGGY is behind Charlotte's Web, the Charlotte's Web oil. That oil has changed the entire cannabis industry. And it's hard to put it into perspective, and you can't say all this change came about because of one person. But if you can say change was impacted on exponential level because of one person, you can absolutely trace that back to Charlotte FIGGY. I think about her all the time. I've thought about her all the time since the very first time I got to see her, and I met Paige and spoke with Paige, Charlotte's mother, and got to understand what their fight was, what their plight was. One of the things that I sat back and I don't want to sound crass in this, and once again, I'm Joshua Littrell with the Veterans for Cannabis podcast. I don't want to sound crass by what I'm going to say here, but we had been beating on the pulpit for years, for decades, in fact, even before I got involved in the cannabis space way back in 2007, 2008, and started growing cannabis in 2010 myself. Before I was even involved, there were many other fighters and advocates that have come over the last 50 to 60 years that don't get any praise at all. You think about Rick Simpson and the RSO oil. You think about so many different advocates that are out there. But Charlotte and her story was the one that changed the entire world. And I don't say that lightly. And I want you all to think about what I just said too. When I said change the world, I really truly do mean that, because cannabis was not considered medicine, over the past 50 to 60 years. And all of a sudden, we had Dr. Gupta and this great documentary they put together, Weed. Um, and it just put a real true face on what cannabis meant to people. It humanized the cannabis plant. Now, I'm not saying that all those advocates and all those people that came before didn't humanize it, but it's a big difference seeing somebody that is long haired, tie dye shirts, whatever it is, free love, man. That's the big, big change versus seeing an 8-year-old child that can't, literally cannot move, that is seizing up 200, 300 times a day, that has no quality of life. And to see this wonderful plant, the cannabis plant, literally change her life, to see her come out of a catatonic state, to see Charlotte become open and start to communicate, to see her smile, to see her eyes light up, to see a child come to life, it humanizes what had not been humanized for decades before this. And today's podcast is basically just a remembrance of Charlotte Figgy. And I want to take a moment just to honor her memory and her legacy, Paige Figgy's legacy that she has laid down for her child, Charlotte. The Stanley brothers, who, yes, didn't make money off of this initially, because they weren't in it to make money. They were in it for the right reasons, which was to change people's lives for the positive. They got into it for the reasons that I do it still to this day. I'm in this industry to make sure that we can improve the quality of life in people's lives. And it can be done through cannabis. So by humanizing this plant and with an image of a child, it changed the world. Cannabis is now used around the globe in so many different countries as a treatment option. Hell, it doesn't matter where you go, you'll see CBD. Now, the 7-Eleven down the street now has CBD available. I don't necessarily know that I trust it or not. And in fact, if you all want CBD, please visit vfcusa.com to get your CBD oil. That's a horribly shameless plug. But it's true. You see it everywhere around the globe. You see cannabis now being normalized because of a wonderful young girl, Charlotte Figgy, and her mother, Paige, who was willing to come out and tell their story. Can you imagine what it must have felt like for Paige and to tell the world that you were giving your daughter an absolutely illegal substance, something that was classified in the same legal ramification area as cocaine, LSD, heroin, and all these other drugs? I can't even imagine. And the first time I talked to Paige, she said it was terrifying. And I only equate it to what I've gone through in my life. And the most terrifying thing I think I ever did was when I actually came out to my family as a cannabis user. Second most terrifying thing was when I spoke in front of a House and Senate committee for the very first time in the state that was not legal, in the South, in Georgia. And I was telling people, hey, I'm using cannabis and it's helping me get better. It's helping me feel better. It's helping me improve my quality of life. Well, that's exactly what Paige was able to do with Charlotte's story. And I thank Dr. Gupta for telling that story. And I also thank the Stanley brothers for getting behind that and for producing something that at the time they weren't able to monetize. They were doing it all out of pocket, the costs on it. They were doing it all because they wanted to see a little girl get better. And by golly, they did. I cannot tell you all. And if you don't know anything about Charlotte Figgy, I urge you all to go research her when you get off this podcast and you get a moment. Charlotte is her first name. Figgy is her last name. It's Figgi. And there's so many different videos that are out there that'll actually show you the proof of this wonderful young lady with Dravet syndrome, this child who had no quality of life, who was given a plant, an extract from a plant that was an illegal plant, where her mother, Paige, decided that I would rather my child live illegally than to die legally at the hands of the state or the federal government and the pharmaceuticals that they were pushing on them at that point in time. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you, and I know Paige would probably say the same thing. Look, you'll never be able to come completely off of the pharmaceuticals, and pharmaceuticals are good. They do a lot of wonderful things. They save millions and millions of lives around the world. I mean, when you think about penicillin and what it's done, the things that pharmaceutical industry do to save people's lives is tremendous and huge, and it works. But the thing that we have got to figure out is, what is that balance between whole plant and where those pharmaceuticals come from? Because as many of you all know, you've listened to the Veterans for Cannabis podcast many, many times now. You understand that almost all drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, are derived from a plant. That's a huge thing, huge thing. So now we have the Stanley brothers making this great medicine, and I'm doing my air quotes, CBD medicine, that was still cannabis. Any way you look at it, it was done illegally back then, and they were doing it for this child who was not given a chance. The doctor said she wouldn't make it past 8 years old. I'm so proud to have gotten to know Paige Figgy and seen Charlotte grow through the years, and to watch her become seizure free, even if just for moments. It's been life changing for me. I can't even imagine what it's been for Paige and her family. And Charlotte, the thing that a lot of people don't understand is she was actually a twin. She has a twin sister named Chase. She also has a brother named Max too. But a lot of times those children get lost in the mix. But can you imagine being a brother or sister and seeing your sister that's your twin, that you didn't really have any interaction with because she never had any words, couldn't articulate a message, and then found this wonderful plant, this cannabis plant, and was able to make medicine from it through the Stanley brothers' hands. And she was able to actually start communicating, to play, to have a good time, to smile and laugh. Paige said the first time she heard her laugh, and laugh, an enjoyable laugh, was life-changing. I can't imagine that. I don't have children, but I have some amazing nieces and nephews, and actually all nieces, scratch that, and they make my life much better. I can't even imagine what Paige felt when Charlotte was able to reduce her seizures through cannabis. I think about Charlotte, think about what she's done for our cannabis industry, and I think about what it took, that little face, to change an entire nation. I thank Dr. Gupta, I thank Paige for putting that story out there. Charlotte died at 13 years old. Like I said earlier, she wasn't supposed to make it past 8. And a lot of people speculated that it was due to COVID-19. Her mother says it wasn't due to COVID-19. She tested negative for it. So, I would have been so upset had this wonderful young girl been taken away from us by this ravaging disease and virus that's killed so many, when she fought so hard to stay alive against those seizures. And then had she lost her battle due to COVID-19, it would have been terrible. She didn't. A death of a child is never a good thing. I'm just thankful it wasn't COVID-19 that took her. And I'm really thankful that Charlotte was able to live to 13 years old. And I know Paige and her parents and her brother and sister are so thankful to have had her. And you know what? I never got to hug Charlotte. I never got to pick her up. I never got to say thank you. This is my way of saying thank you. This tribute podcast to Charlotte Figgy, who has done so much to change the cannabis industry and has